Hi, my name is Dr. Cara Daly, and I'm a pediatric psychologist in Northeast Ohio. And there'll be some slides that you can look through while I talk. But I'm actually a training director for an organization called Daily Behavioral Health, which is a Christian behavioral health practice. And we primarily specialize in children ages from 12 months to the early 20s. And about 50% of the kids that we see at the practice have autism spectrum disorders. And about the other half are just your general clinical and pediatric psychology that we see there. I'm also executive director for Inner Health Ministries Child Center, which is a nonprofit agency that provides after-school programs and a summer treatment program for children with autism spectrum disorders, as well as children with disruptive behavior disorders. And the best way to describe that is, even though we have a Christian practice, I felt like we weren't talking about God and Christ as much as I wanted to, and as much as I felt God wanted us to. So we created this organization where we're providing research-based interventions while introducing the gospel to our children and families. And in addition to that, I am a board member for Key Ministry. So what we'll be talking to you about today is autism spectrum disorders and just practical tips for the church. So in order to first help our children with autism, as well as adults with autism in our church, I think it's best to start back and see, really what autism is. And so what I'm going to do is go through just basic definitions of autism spectrum disorders. Then I'm going to touch on a little bit about just associate disorders, other disorders that are known with autism, how prevalent it is and where it comes from, a basic evaluation process, and then what are research-based treatments and more of the practical tips for your church. So to begin, autism spectrum disorders fall on what's called a pervasive developmental disorder spectrum. There's several different kinds of pervasive developmental disorders, but 3 that are on the autism spectrum. So we have your general diagnosis of autism, and then we have Asperger's disorder, and then we have something called pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. So if you do have your notes and you want to follow along, I've created what I call graphical organizer, which lots of times we use with individuals on the autism spectrum, but it's a way of organizing how those look. So within autism, to have a diagnosis, well, first back up a little bit, because what is a pervasive developmental disorder? Because I think this is really good to understand when we're talking about autism. Pervasive means it's throughout the whole body, it's throughout the whole lifespan. Developmental, you're going to see ages before the age of 3. And then disorder is not a delay, and that's the part that's sometimes hard for parents to kind of accept. It doesn't mean the child's going to catch up. A disorder means that there's an impairment. There's something different about their child. And so that's where we get this pervasive developmental disorder, or PDD. And sometimes you're going to hear your family saying that word PDD, and that's where that comes from. So when we talk about one of the pervasive developmental disorders, autism, you have to have 3 major deficits or impairments to have that diagnosis. And the first one, you're going to have a diagnosis in social interaction. And when we're working with a child with autism, we see this manifest in a lot of different ways, but you have things like eye-to-eye gaze, where the child might not be watching you as you turn, they're not going to be following or tracking your eyes. Facial expressions. Some of our kids have a very flat, what we call affect, so they might come in and they're just very flat in their face. Or they have a hard time reading our expressions. Again, they have the exact same emotions we do, but they might not express them in the same way, or they have a hard time reading our emotions. So even though I'm smiling, they might not see that. Or if I'm angry, they might not see that facial expression. Their body posture. I have some kids who, when you're talking with someone, you might be interacting and you're using nonverbal cues. I have a lot of our children are very flat, or hands down, just very awkward or different about their body posture, as well as their gestures. So I have some children who don't use any kind of nonverbal body language with their hands, or I have other children who do the exact opposite, and they're so elaborate and all over the place. So there's an impairment in that piece. The other thing we see is there's a failure to develop peer relationships appropriate to a developmental level. And so what that means is you see a lot of individuals who might be interacting, like a child might be interacting who's 5, they get along better with kids who are 3, or they get along better with kids who are adults. We also see a lack of spontaneous seeking to share enjoyment and interest. So a lot of times when, let's say, a child likes airplanes, a typical child, when they see an airplane, will be like, "Mommy, look," and they point at the airplane. Versus a child with autism isn't going to do that. They're not going to share that many times with their mom or dad or a friend. And the same way they might not want to share your interests or even ask about your interests. So if you just went on a trip to Disney World, some kid might ask, "Oh, how was the trip to Disney World? Did you get to see Mickey?" That child may not ask that piece. And the other thing that they might have an impairment on is what we call a lack of social or emotional reciprocity, or lack of empathy. And one of the best examples I have came from a mother who said, "I fell down the stairs and I was crying, and I don't know what hurt more, the fact that I broke my leg and I was crying, or the fact that my child was standing there watching and was completely unaware that I was crying and that I had broke my leg." So we see a lot of things socially that are, again, this impairment. Then you're also going to see some deficits in communication. So, and again, there's a spectrum. So when we say that, every child is very different. So we have some children who are completely nonverbal, and we have other children who are extremely verbal. But there's usually some kind of deficit in that communication where, there's an impairment in their speech, whether or not it's in their intonation, or voice tone volume. I have some kids who sound like they actually have accents speak a foreign language, because the way they talk, and they talk at a high-pitched voice or a low-pitched voice, it can be very different. They also have trouble with initiating that conversation. So many times our children who are on the spectrum are very focused on themselves. And so if they're focused on Spider-Man and that's all they're thinking about, again, they're not looking up and saying, "Hey, Sam, how was your day?" or "What would you like to do?" They're focused on themselves. They don't initiate that conversation. And again, that part of that delay, or that impairment, not delay, but impairment in communication, could be that a repetitiveness to their communication. They talk about the same thing over and over again, or they have a very specific, what we call idiosyncratic language. So they could say, "Oh, don't even get me started," and they do this with their hand motion 3 times during a 2-minute conversation. Or they could say something about Spider-Man over and over and over again in that conversation. When they're really little, we also see this impairment in communication when they play, because when we're working with a 3 or 5-year-old, there's this back and forth imaginative communication play that goes on. So they might be taking their cars and going vroom, vroom, vroom. "Oh, here comes a dinosaur. Oh, he's crashing the car." There's a back and forth. It's the same thing with communication when they're older. There's a back and forth that many times is missing, a reciprocal communication. So when they're playing, we're looking to see if they have that, and if that's age appropriate. Because again, I have some kids who don't engage in that back and forth play, or I have kids who engage over and above. I have a kid that I've worked with for 10 years, and he literally, when he was 2, he wrote all the rest of the sequels for Star Wars that haven't been out. And now that he's 12, he literally acts them out in school. So he'll be sitting in his desk at school, and he'll be like going, vroom, shoo, 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 shoo. And he has a great back and forth imaginative play, but it's not age appropriate. It goes above and beyond. So that's the second impairment you see. So we have socialization, communication, and then the third impairment is what we call repetitive or stereotypical behaviors. And again, each kid is very different, but we have kids who get very focused. It's not obsessive compulsive disorder, but it's like that in the sense that they get very, very focused on a certain topic or subject, and it's just over and over and over again that they either engage in it or play in it or talk about it. We also see they get very, what we call rigid. They get stuck on certain routines. And so if I was to say, "Hey, we'll be done with class today at 11:30," if I was in Sunday school, and at 11:32, their mom is not back yet from picking them up, you're going to see the child's anxiety peak, because he's thinking, "You said we're going to be done at 11:30. And I'll literally have kids that will start rocking and will start to tantrum because they're like, "It's 11:32. Why isn't my mom coming? Why is my mom coming to pick me up? You said at 11:30 she was coming." So they get very stuck on certain rituals or routines. And so it's important when we're working with them not to use always that very concrete language if we don't know when mom is going to be picking them up. We also see what we call stereotype or repetitive motor mannerisms. And so some kids engage in hand flapping or toe walking, some peculiar things that they might just do with their fingers, just any kind of repetitive motor mannerisms, as well as we might see different things. Instead of playing with a certain toy in a correct way, they might get overly focused on something and what we call stim off of it, or something where they're looking at it just like in a certain way or at a certain angle. So those are the criteria that doctors use to diagnose a child with autism. Now, of course, we see a lot of other things that aren't necessarily in those definitions. We have a lot of children who are very sensitive to lights, sounds, touch, taste, any of the senses. So, and again, with a light, they could look at a light in a certain way, or if sounds are too loud, they might cover their ears. I had one child, we used a dry erase marker in the class, and it makes sometimes that sound that you don't like to hear. And the girl literally closed her ears and then started rocking. And at that point, if we would have called attention to her, she actually probably would have gone into a full-blown tantrum. But at that time, the instructor actually just said, "Ooh, that marker made a strange noise. I think I'll use a different one." And the girl immediately just stopped and was like, "Oh," kind of like someone understood me. Yeah, that was loud and bothering me. So we have to watch for those senses. The other thing with that rigidness that we see is when we say things, they take it very literally. So if sarcasm, idioms can be difficult for them. So if I was to say, "Hey, we'll put our heads together about that," which I have to a child before, I've actually had kids say, "Ouch, that would hurt." Or I had one child I hadn't seen in like a couple months, and I said, "Hey, stranger," and he immediately started crying, and he said, "You don't know my name, you don't remember me." And I had to explain, "No, I was being sarcastic, it's good to see you, I haven't seen you in a while." So we have to be careful with our language sometimes. So that's autism. Now we have this other pervasive developmental disorder called Asperger's. And the difference between autism and Asperger's is the communication isn't impaired. So we only have the deficits in socialization and those repetitive behaviors, repetitive and stereotypical behaviors. And in fact, their communication has to be average, and many times it's above average. We call it pedantic speech, where it's a formal speech. And these are my little 2-year-olds that walk in my office and are saying, "Hello, Dr. Daly, this is my mother and father. It's very nice to meet you." And I'll be like, "You're two. Hi." And so our children with Asperger's have, like I said, normal communication. They're also are supposed to have a normal IQ. And so whereas autism, you can actually have a intellectual deficit when it comes to IQ, or you could be gifted. So those are the difference between autism and Asperger's. Now we also have this other category called pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. And so parents will many times come in and say, "I have a child who has PDD and OS." And that's what that means. What that means, it's kind of like a junk category. It means that the child had some symptoms anywhere on the pervasive developmental disorder spectrum or autism spectrum, and but not enough to meet criteria for autism or Asperger's. So we put them in this PDD and OS category. Regardless, they're still considered in the autism spectrum, and many times the treatment can be very similar for them. The other piece with autism that comes is there's a lot of different kinds of associated disorders, comorbid disorders. And so this is what makes life very interesting and hard and difficult for our parents. It's not just autism. Many times we see autism, it's driven by anxiety. So when a child is stressed, there's not routine, and things are, there's lots of changes going on, their stress level or anxiety goes up, and then we see them have more tantrums, they start to engage in more repetitive behaviors because their anxiety goes up, and then it looks like their autism symptoms get worse. But with that also comes a lot of times symptoms of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And some kids may actually have more symptoms of ADHD than others. But what you see with that is kids have a hard time focusing and paying attention, whether or not it's because they're so anxious, or they truly have a hard time organizing thoughts and breaking things down. Most of our kids have a very hard time breaking things down. If I was to tell a child, I need to go clean, you need to go clean your room, they tantrum. But if I was to say, I need you to pick up the Legos. Oh, great job picking up the Legos. Now I need you to pick up your shoes. Oh, thank you for picking up your shoes. Break those steps down into little tiny steps. They have so much more success. That's the same thing at church or in the classroom. Just giving an activity sheet that has multiple things on it can be very stressful. But if you break it down into smaller steps and actually even cover some of the things on that sheet so they just see one thing at a time, can be a lot easier for them. But within also ADHD, we have kids who have lots more energy. We have kids who are impulsive and they do things without thinking, and that's very common that we see with our children with autism. They don't think before they do it. Also, it's the same thing when they get angry. Many times, we know when we're getting angry and what we need to do to kind of relax or pray. Hey, this is our time, I need to ask God for help. But a child who's on the spectrum, or even with ADHD, they go from 0 to 10 like that. It's like a raw emotion. So that can be a huge challenge. Also, many times we see kids who have what's called oppositional defiant disorder. And those are kids who look like they're actively defying you. They're actively looking like they're trying to annoy you. Some kids actually have this disorder, but lots of times our kids look like they have it and they really don't. Many times our children with autism are good kids, but because they're so focused or obsessed or perseverating on something, it looks like they're actively defying us, or it looks like they're actively annoying a child because they're not talking about their interests. Also, we see children who have learning disabilities, and that can, is just also another challenge. As well as, like I said, some of our children can have mental retardation or an intellectual deficit that comes along with autism. So the big question I get a lot is, it looks like autism disorder keeps increasing. Why? Well, we do know, 1 in 110 children are diagnosed every 20 minutes. It's growing at a rate of 10 to 17%. It's 4 times more common in boys. And there's this question, where does this come from? We do know there's some genetic pieces to it, and that's just an important piece to know, because many times if you have one child in the family that has autism, it's very likely there could be another member as well. But there is a lot of research that says there is a genetic piece that can happen, whether or not it's from the parents or if it's from just a specific gene that's been mutated or deleted. And there's very specific genes that we know about, and those are in those notes if you're curious. And I make a joke myself. I say, I have anxiety. I'm a type A personality. My husband has ADHD, and so the chances of us having a child on the spectrum are probably pretty high. So when you have a child, especially in the church, lots of times the church can be the first time where a child gets recognized and having some of these kinds of behaviors. And it's not the church's responsibility to seek these kids out, but at the same time, depending on your church and your children's ministry director or the leadership there, those would be the people that would, want to approach somebody, and there should be a system for doing that. But many times there might be families who come to you and say, my child just got diagnosed, and here's the evaluation. And they hand it to you, and you're like, what is this? And so it is common for these children to get what we call full evaluation, and that comes with like IQ, and for IQ we know 100 is average, and there's like we call a bell curve. So like 70 and below is considered like mentally retarded or cognitively deficit, and 130 and above is considered gifted. But most 68% of the population, we all have IQs between 85 and 115. So if you get those reports from our parents, and I know our parents at our church have given us those reports, that's something. They get an IQ test. They get a lot of tests to look at, like I said, that communication piece, that socialization piece, and those repetitive behavior pieces. And so then you have parents who will come in and say, okay, well, we've got an evaluation, our child has autism, and they need this, this, and this, and this, because they're going to be coming to church, and they're going to be here every day. And this is or not every day, but once a week or multiple times during the week. And that can sometimes make it very difficult. And so I want to talk about, what is the standard of treatment that many of these parents are seeking out, and then what's really, what the church should be doing. let's go to Scripture and let's really think about, why God has created all of us. And I think it's really important to look at, such as, Genesis 1:27, Corinthians 3:18, that, we're made in God's image, and we've been given different gifts. We're made differently for a reason, like Romans 12:6 says. And we're all made for a purpose, as Ephesians 2:10 says. And all of us, because we are different members of the body, we're an essential part of the whole body. So each of these kids are an essential part of the whole body, as Romans 12:4 and 5 says. In my profession, I've really clung to, I really think a lot about John 9:3, and that's a passage where the disciples asked Jesus after seeing a blind man, why is he blind? Is it because of his sin or his parents' sin? And Jesus says, you know what? This is so the work of God, the glory of God could be seen through that person. And I honestly think that's something that's happening with our children with autism, so that God's glory can be seen through them. So when we talk about treatment with a child with autism, we know that there's a couple research-based things that we know that are helpful, that these kids are gaining skills. And we know that it's a lot of work for our parents. It's supposed to be about a minimum of 25 hours a week from the time the child gets diagnosed at an early age. It's individualized. It should be done at the school, home, and community settings. And it is done a lot of times one-on-one. So you're working with someone one-on-one with your child. And there's a heavy piece of a parent involvement. So we also know that there's, besides this intensive interventions, we know that there is a lot of our children who receive pharmacological management. So there's a lot of medication that can be helpful to these children. So again, important to know, because sometimes the children might be on medication, they might be on a different kind of medication, they could be changing medications. So a child that you see one week with autism could look very different a different week if their medication is being adjusted. But we know there are some helpful things, whether it's antipsychotics or depressants or stimulants. And again, I just put one slide there with a website for American Academy of Pediatrics if anyone is interested in seeing that. We also know as part of that treatment, there's a lot of speech and language, and this is called a PECS, or Picture Exchange Communication System. And what that is, it's using actual visual cards that map out each step. So if you remember me saying a child with autism likes that routine or structure, it's helpful to have a picture system so the kids can actually see what they're doing next. And so even if it's in Sunday school and you have a specific thing that you're doing with a child where they come in and first they have to sit at their chair, then it could be a picture of a chair. Then the next thing could be, we're going to memorize a memory verse. And so it could have a picture of a Bible because they're going to open the Bible. And then the next picture could be while we go out in the hallway and do music time. So it could be a picture of doing music. And then it could be, then we come in and do craft time and snack time. So there's different pictures of each of that child's schedule of what they're going to do. And that can be very beneficial for the child, because they're like, oh, I know this is next and this is next. So, and many times those techniques are used within what's called applied behavioral analysis, and that's ABA. It's a strict behavioral intervention that's used, that has had a lot of efficacy in teaching kids new behaviors. And doing what we call ABA, or behavioral interventions in the classroom, can be very hard within the Sunday school. So what I want to do with the rest of the time is actually just give you some practical tips. All right, so knowing that there are some very specific research interventions that are out there for these children that are pretty intensive, like I said, 25 to 40 hours a week, what do you do with them when they're in the church setting for an hour or two? And again, I would go back to the leaders in the church and the ministry director and the children's ministry director, and find out what is the goal. If it's working in the Sunday school room, it's finding out, is your goal to give that parent respite, and the meaning that time to worship collectively as the church, and your job is to keep their child safe? Or is it actually that you're creating a ministry where you're actually trying to teach that child more behaviors? Because if that goal is to actually teach the child more behaviors, then you're going to have to be as structured as possible and have be very consistent every Sunday with that child. So I want to just give you some tidbits about what are some positives of the ABA stuff that our parents are using. So the first thing is they use something called reinforcement. And it's very simple. It's things that immediately follow behavior. It increases the frequency of that behavior. It's always very important to reinforce our kids, like the books say, 11 times for every punishment that we give them. And that's very hard because when you're working with a child with autism, it's a lot of, you need to sit down, no, put your pencil down. It can be very negative. So you have to do a ton more positive and say more positive things to them than the negative. And the reason being is we've discovered that our children who have autism as well as ADHD, they're stimulated. The negative and the positive is both reinforcing for them. I mean, imagine being a parent to a child with autism where both the negative and positive is reinforcing. So when you say no, I've just reinforced the kid. If I'm positive, I've just reinforced the kid. And so it's very, very hard. We have to work with our parents in being very neutral and positive. We don't want them to see, that anger and yelling, because that can stimulate the child and make things worse. So it's always better to reinforce them with the positive than the negative. And so the way you do that is just working with the child first in what we call non-contingent reinforcement. And this is basically what the teachers do on the first day of school. And you just have to do that every time you see the child. And you're reinforcing them for everything. Oh, I love how you're walking into the room. Oh, I love your shoes today. Oh, I love this about you. You're doing great. High five for this. You're reinforcing everything. And the reason for that is you want them then to see that person who's doing this as the reinforcer, because they're going to then want to go in and, ooh, I want to work with Sally because she liked everything about me. She liked my shoes. She liked how I walk. She liked... But we want to do that, especially in the beginning, and especially when things get a little harder. Just start putting on what we call just reinforcing every little thing they're doing. And then once we want them to start doing things, even if it's just something as sitting in their chair, we call that contingent reinforcement, where we're actually setting that expectation. And so first we need to start at the very basics. So first, if you're working with a younger kid, you need to see if they can even sit in the chair and for how long they can sit. Because I know a lot of my kids can't sit in a chair for longer than 30 seconds. And if that's the case, then that's where you need to start reinforcing them. They've sat in the chair, oh, great job sitting. And after they sat for 30 seconds, oh, I love how you're sitting, great job, high five. And so they know that that's what they're working on. If they aren't even able to sit, then you want to start even closer to that. You might want to say, Johnny, I need you to sit in your chair. And as soon as Johnny has gone towards the chair, oh, Johnny, I like how you're moving towards the chair. Oh, Johnny, thanks for touching the chair. Oh, thanks for sitting in the chair. I want you to sit in the chair just for 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, great job sitting. So you're starting at the very, very basics, and you're breaking down to very, very small steps. The key is to catch them being positive, or catch them being good, and make sure you're reinforcing those positive behaviors. Another piece that's really important is how we prompt our child. And prompts are just any kind of cues we give them. And there's verbal prompts, there's gestural prompts, there's physical prompts, and there's environmental prompts. And so verbal prompts are things we ask, but then we have to use gestural prompts. I need you to pick this up, and you're pointing. You sometimes might need to use a physical prompt. You've asked them, I need you to pick up the toy over there, and they haven't done it. And then you follow through with what we call physical prompt. I need you to pick up the toy, and you've touched their hand to pick up the toy. And then even though you've helped them pick up the toy, you're still reinforcing them and say, oh, great job picking up the toy. Environmental prompts are huge with children with autism. Having things in the Sunday school rooms that actually have, or, what they're doing for that day, like I said, with those picture cues or task list on their desk. Anything, signs, posters, classroom rules is going to be very, very important for your child. Many times, if you have a harder child, some classes have started what we call a token system. And a token system is just where a child is receiving tokens, and then they're going to receive what we call backup reinforcer later for that token. So you could, if you're working with the child for an hour, they could be earning 10 tokens for that hour. And at the end of that hour, if they've gotten 10 tokens, then they know that mom and dad's going to reinforce them by giving them an extra 15 minutes of watching TV or something like that. So it's something you have to work out ahead of time with the parents so they know what kind of reinforcer they'd get after church. But it can be very, very effective. And so in order to do that, you have to work with the child ahead of time and even have a list of what behaviors are going to earn tokens. It could be sitting in the seat. It could be reciting a memory verse. It could be playing nicely with a child. It could be having good hands during that hour. Whatever it is, and each time they've done that good behavior, you've given them a token. And while you give them that token, it's not just, here, good job. You have to be very specific. You have to say, great job sitting in your seat. Great job sharing with that child. Great job reciting your memory verse. And you need to be specific, because if you remember, I said our kids get very anxious and are very focused on something. They perseverate on something. So let's say he just sat in his chair, and all of a sudden he starts, perseverating on Spider-Man, and you give him a token. He might be thinking you just gave him a token for thinking about Spider-Man. You really do have to say, great job sitting in your chair, so they know that that's what they got their token for. And then they also need to know what kinds of reinforcers or prizes they're going to get for their tokens. And again, that's something can be worked out with mom or dad. And I've, in your packet, I've actually, in the slides, actually put on there a sample token system or even behavior chart that can sometimes be used just for a Sunday. It's important, again, even before the child gets in, as soon as they get in, saying, oh, you're going to earn 10 tokens this hour. What are you going to earn them for? What are you working for? And so they have in their mind, well, I'm working for 15 minutes of TV when I got home from church. And that can then help keep them on task. The other strategy that we don't like to talk about, but it happens. The kids are doing things that aren't good, and we have to discipline them. And again, if you remember me saying, we use the positive first, and try and use 11 is too hard. Try and use at least 6 positives for every negative that you have to engage in with the child. But sometimes we use discipline or punishment. We have to. And something serves as punishment if it immediately follows the behavior and it decreases the frequency of that behavior. And I say that because sometimes our kids, when they're being not so good, we take them out of the class they were in. And in fact, that's exactly what they wanted. And so that can reinforce their behavior. So you have to know what's a punishment and what's not. And there's different kinds. One that can be very effective is just ignoring. And that is if a child is doing something for attention, if they're screaming, if they're swearing, and I know that's hard if they're doing that even in the church setting, but they're doing that for attention, it's the best to ignore them. And sometimes it's best to ignore them, and we pair it with something called, we call it DRO, or direct reinforcement of another behavior. And to do that, we reinforce another child for doing what we want. So even if it's a child that's screaming, I'm ignoring the child that's screaming, and let's say Tommy is talking very nicely to me. I'm like, oh, Tommy, thank you for using a quiet voice. Oh, yes, what do you want? Or, Tommy, thanks for saying excuse me. And I'm giving him attention, but I'm ignoring Bobby, who's screaming. Or if you're trying to get a child to sit in the chair, you ignore the child who's under the table and all over the place, but the children that are sitting there, you're like, oh, great job sitting, Tommy, great job sitting, Sally. Oh, I love how everyone's looking at me and sitting. And because they're getting all that attention, you might then see Bobby pop up and sit in his seat. There's also what we call response cost, where you take things away. So very simply, if a child is fighting over markers with another child or some kind of toy, you can very simply take the toy away and say, you know what, I need you to apologize to Sally, and I'll give you the markers back. If you take something away from a child on the spectrum, you need to make sure that they know what they need to do to get it back. Because I've had some of my older kids tell me when they were younger and they heard the word no, or when something was taken away. Remember when I said they're very concrete and literal? They've taken that word no and thinking no means never forever. And that's something I never thought of. But if someone says, if he asks, can I go to the bathroom? And you say no, they're like, no, never? I can't go to the bathroom? They're going to tantrum. And again, you don't mean no forever when you say it, but for a child on the spectrum, they could interpret it that way. So it's very important to say, no, not now, but you know what, in about 15, 20 minutes, we might be able to, we'll have a break and you might be able to go. Or, you know, hey, I know you really want to do this. That might be something we can do next week. But you have to watch using the word no, or if you take something away, so they know when they're going to get it, or when it's appropriate to get it back. There's other things that I know other churches have used, such as timeout. Again, I think that's something that has to come from leadership to do something like that. But just know that timeout is a timeout away from reinforcers. And so if a child is doing something for attention and tantruming, you can very simply just have the child tantrum without anyone else paying attention. And it could mean removing some of the other kids if they're a danger to others. But again, that's something I think you need to talk about with the leadership at the church. One key thing is, though, and I've seen this happen, physical restraint should not be used in the church. That's just not something, there's liability issues, that's something definitely to stay away from. But again, if you're focusing on doing all the positives, 6 positives for every negative, many times you're not going to see a lot of the negative behaviors happen. Some other strategies that can be helpful to use, there's something called social stories. It's created by Carol Gray. And social stories is a very concrete way of breaking down steps for a child in a fun story format. And even though the research isn't 100% clear whether or not this is effective, more research needs to be done, but it's showing some trends. And so a social story can be something as simple as reading the story to the child as soon as they get into the setting, or having the parents even read it before going to church. And so this is a social story that we created with a child with autism. And so it was simply, my family usually goes to church on Sundays. I go to church with my mom, dad, and sister Molly. When we go to church, I usually go to Sunday school with my sister. We do many things when we go to church. Sometimes we listen to people talk about the Bible. We may sing, and we usually pray. It is important to be a good listener when I am at church. I should try to be quiet, especially when someone is talking or praying. When we are praying, I usually put my head down and clasp my hands together. Praying is when we silently talk to God. God hears us even when we don't talk out loud. If we are singing, I should sing, but not too loud. I should still be able to hear others singing around me too. When we sing, I should remember that I am singing to God. He likes it when I sing to him. Going to church to learn about God is important to my family. I will try to remember to be a good listener at church. This will make God and my family happy. So again, it was just breaking down steps in a very concrete way for a child with autism. And you can see some of the pieces that we put in there about even praying. Praying is when we silently talk to God. A lot of our children on the spectrum have a hard time understanding how to talk to God. When I say they're concrete or literal, we know God is very concrete and real, but for a child on the spectrum, God is abstract. It's not someone they think that they can, touch and talk to, even though we can. And so it's important to put those kinds of concepts down. Even with singing or praying, singing, we need to remember that I'm singing to God. We need to remember not to sing too loud, because I have lots of my kids who like to belt out the songs and they can't hear anyone else singing around them. So whatever it is, you're breaking it down into a fun story format for them. Another piece to remember, because they are so concrete and literal and not abstract, we have to watch when we're presenting the gospel to them how to do that. We need to use words and phrases they understand. I've had to learn that. I've had to avoid using symbolic terms like born again, ask Jesus to come into your heart, and open your heart. I've actually had kids say, I was already born. I was born once. What do you mean, open my heart? Are you going to do surgery on me? These are real questions they've asked, so it's hard for them to understand those kinds of things. So you want to present the Bible as a factual document, which it is, and have a one-on-one dialogue with the child. Open up the Bible, use scripture, and I gave some very specific key points here, but explaining God wants you to become his child. Why do you think he wants you in his family? You can use John 3:1 for that. Every person in the world has done wrong things. The Bible's word for doing wrong is sin. What do you think should happen to us when we sin? And you can use Romans 6:23. God loves you so much that he sent his son to die on the cross to take the punishment for your sin. Because Jesus never sinned, he is the only one who can take the punishment for your sin. And you can use 1 Corinthians 15:3 or 1 John 4:14 in scripture to show them that. Are you sorry for your sin? Tell God that you are. Do you believe Jesus died for your sin and then rose again? Tell him that too. If you tell God you are sorry for your sin and believe that Jesus died to take your sin away, God forgives you. And you can see 1 John 1:9. And lastly, you can say the Bible says that when you believe Jesus is God's Son and is alive today, you receive God's gift of eternal life. And this gift makes you a child of God. This means God is with you now and forever. In John 3:16 would be a good verse for that. So in closing, what are some what we call key interventions? Number one, love God and love the kids. We know that, as I said, some of those behavioral interventions can really work, but we have to focus on teaching the positive behaviors. Thank you for sitting in your seat. Being very positive with them and not focusing on the negative. Reinforce them immediately, because like I said, if they just sat in their seat, they're already thinking about something else, so you have to do it right away. Give them prompts, visual prompts, gestural prompts, verbal prompts, and environmental. Break down steps into small directions for them. You want to be concrete in what you say to them, but you also want to teach flexibility. It can be a very hard thing to do. You can use visual organizers to break concepts down into smaller steps. Give prompts whenever there's a change in schedule. If there's someone new in the Sunday school classroom, and many times there is, or in any kind of lesson, they have to know what teacher is going to be there. If they can have a buddy that's someone that's there consistently, it can make a huge difference. Any buddy is great to have, but if it's someone that can be there every Sunday or every time they're in church, it can be very important for them. You want to be preventive. You want to be consistent. You want to keep the kids busy. Many times just keeping them busy can reduce some of the maladaptive behaviors that we can see. You can use social stories, and you can also think about using that token economy system or daily report card. So I hope this was helpful in understanding autism and just giving you some practical tips for the church. I'd be happy to talk to anyone. My contact information is on the Inclusion Fusion website, so feel free to contact me, and we'll be praying for all the churches that are involved in this, and just wish you the best of luck.